In the dense pine forests of northern Minnesota, October 1934, the Great Depression wasn't just a headline in a newspaper. It was a physical weight that pressed the breath out of every living thing. While the rest of America choked on the dust storms of the Great Plains, a woman named Sarah Jenkins stood at the edge of a jagged crater in the earth and saw something no one else could see. The crater was fresh, carved just 3 days earlier when the county's largest white pine had finally surrendered to 4 centuries of gravity and a violent late-season thunderstorm. The tree lay stretched across the forest floor like a fallen titan, its massive root ball torn from the earth to create a vertical wall nearly 20 feet high and 15 feet wide. To a logger, it was timber. To a passerby, it was a raw wound in the forest floor, a symbol of destruction. But Sarah didn't see destruction. She saw a fortress. She saw a home. Standing beside her were 3 children who had grown up too fast. Caleb, 12 years old, carried himself with the stoic, serious determination of a man, his eyes scanning the tree line for danger. Emily, 9, was quiet and watchful, possessing a resilience that mirrored her mother's. And little 5-year-old Lily clutched Sarah's hand, staring at the fallen giant with a mixture of terrifying awe and confusion. They had been walking for 2 days, carrying their entire lives in bundles on their backs, sleeping under the open stars, and eating the last of the hardtack bread Sarah had baked before they fled. They had nowhere to go because the world had closed its doors. Her husband, Tom, hadn't been a cruel man, just a weak one, hollowed out by the shame of the bank taking their farm and the sawmill closing down. When he vanished in June, he left no note and no money, just a silent admission that the weight of responsibility had finally crushed him. The town of Iron Creek had been no kinder. The church offered prayers but no shelter. The county offered a solution that made Sarah's blood run cold. The orphanage for the children and the poorhouse for her. That was an arrangement that would have shattered their family forever. "Mama?" Caleb asked, his voice cracking in the cold air. "Are we stopping?" Sarah looked down into the hollow behind the root wall. It was roughly 10 feet deep and 12 feet across, shielded from the biting north wind by the wall of soil and tangled roots. It was barely a hole. But Sarah looked at it and saw walls that didn't need to be built. She saw insulation that nature had already provided. She realized that if her children were going to survive the winter, she had to stop waiting for a savior. She had to become one. "Put your packs down," Sarah said, her voice steady with a desperate, impossible determination. She pointed into the earth. "We aren't running anymore. We're building." That first morning, the clock wasn't ticking in seconds or minutes. It was measured in the fading angle of the sun and the biting drop in temperature. Sarah knew that winter in northern Minnesota didn't knock politely. It kicked the door down. The work began immediately. It was a blur of frantic, back-breaking labor. Sarah, Caleb, and Emily descended into the crater, their hands becoming their primary tools. They hauled out loose rocks, tangled roots, and damp clumps of soil, clearing the floor of what would become their living room. Little Lily, too small for the heavy lifting, gathered smooth stones into piles, believing she was helping build a castle rather than a bunker. By twilight, their hands were raw and blistered, their muscles screaming in protest, but the hole was clear. That first night, they huddled together in the raw earth, pulling every quilt they owned over their heads, using the massive root wall as a windbreak against the freezing draft. It was terrifyingly cold and dark. But as Sarah held her shivering children, she realized the earth itself was shielding them. They weren't exposed on the open plain. They were tucked away. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah tapped into a reservoir of knowledge she didn't know she possessed. She remembered watching her father, a carpenter who had built barns across the Midwest, working with wood and earth. She realized the dense clay soil of the crater wasn't an obstacle. It was an asset. Unlike loose dirt, the clay was stable. She began to carve into the walls, squaring them off to create flat surfaces, even digging out shelves for their meager supplies and a sleeping platform raised off the cold floor. The massive root ball of the fallen pine became the 4th wall of their home. A 15-foot-high tangle of wood and stone that blocked the north wind better than any man-made structure could. To seal the gaps, Sarah and the children wove pine branches between the roots and plastered them with a thick mixture of clay and dried grass. As it dried, it hardened into a natural concrete, tough and windproof. But the roof was the engineering marvel born of desperation. The fallen trunk of the giant pine lay just a few feet from the edge of their pit. Sarah saw it as a natural ridgepole. She and Caleb spent 3 grueling days felling smaller saplings with a hand axe, dragging them back to the site. They laid these poles from the top of the root wall across to the fallen trunk, creating a sturdy, sloped frame. Over this skeleton, they layered thick pine boughs to block the light, then strips of birch bark peeled from deadfalls to shed the water. Finally, they shoveled nearly a foot of soil onto the top. The weight locked the structure in place, and the dirt provided insulation that would prove to be their salvation. When they finished, the shelter was invisible. From 10 feet away, it looked like nothing more than the forest floor, a slight rise in the ground beside a fallen tree. But inside, it was a sanctuary. It was a 12-foot square room with earthen walls and a scent of pine and soil. Sarah carved a niche for a fireplace against the back wall, digging a chimney vent up through the loose soil. When she finally struck a match and the dry kindling caught fire, the draft pulled the smoke up and out, filling the small space with a dry, radiant heat. Caleb looked at his mother, his face smeared with clay but his eyes bright in the firelight. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were homesteaders. They had dug into the ribs of the earth, and for the first time in months, the world outside felt far away. They were safe. Or so they thought. Winter descended on northern Minnesota with the ferocity of a starving wolf. By late November, the hawk, the biting wind sweeping down from the Canadian border, had buried the landscape under 3 feet of powder. In the towns nearby, folks were burning through their woodpiles and praying for spring, their drafty shanties leaking heat like sieves. But deep in the forest, beneath the frost line, the Jenkins family lived in a pocket of perpetual autumn. The earth was a miraculous insulator. While the outside air temperature plunged to 40 below zero, the temperature inside their earthen home hovered steadily around 50 degrees. It wasn't hot, but it was survivable. They had become subterranean creatures, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the fire and the rationing of the single tallow candle Sarah allowed them each evening. However, their greatest enemy wasn't the cold. It was visibility. To stay together, they had to remain invisible. Sarah knew that a woman alone with 3 children in the wilderness would be seen by the county authorities not as a pioneer, but as a tragedy waiting to happen. If they were found, the family would be shattered. Maintaining this invisibility proved harder than building the walls. The smoke from their fire filtered up through the soil roof, usually dispersing in the wind. But on still, gray days, it rose in a telltale column above the treetops. Paths began to form in the snow between their hidden door and the frozen creek where they chipped ice for water. The inevitable happened on a Tuesday morning in early December. Jack Miller, a solitary trapper with a face weathered like old saddle leather and a reputation for silence, was checking his beaver lines along the creek. He wasn't looking for people. He avoided them whenever possible. But he knew the woods the way a preacher knows scripture. And when he saw a faint wisp of blue smoke rising from what appeared to be solid ground, he stopped dead in his tracks. Expecting a poacher, Jack approached silently, his buffalo-plaid coat blending into the shadows, his rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm. He crept toward the fallen pine, expecting to find a makeshift camp. Instead, he watched in disbelief as the earth seemed to open up. Sarah emerged from behind the root wall, a wooden bucket in her hand, her breath clouding in the freezing air. She looked less like a desperate vagrant and more like a part of the forest itself, wrapped in layers of mended wool and deer hide. When she turned and saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, she didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply set the bucket down in the snow and stood tall, placing herself between the stranger and the hidden entrance where her children were sleeping. Her eyes met his with a fierce, terrifying resolve. It was the look of a mother bear cornered in her den. Jack lowered his rifle slowly. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the protective stance. Then he saw the small, pale face of Caleb peering out from the dark opening behind her, wide-eyed and clutching a sharpened stick. The silence stretched between them, heavy and sharp as the winter air. "You got kids down there, ma'am?" Jack's voice was gravelly, unused to conversation. "I do," Sarah answered, her voice steady. "And we are warm, and we are fed." Jack looked at the makeshift chimney, the cleverly hidden door, the sheer audacity of their survival. He had seen men, strong, seasoned woodsmen, die in these woods with better gear than this woman had. He looked back at Sarah. He didn't see a crime. He saw grit. He saw a spirit that matched the savage beauty of the land he loved. He nodded once, shifting his weight. "Storm's coming tonight, a bad one. You got enough wood?" "We do," Sarah lied. They were running low. Jack didn't call her on it. He simply reached into his pack, pulled out 2 cured rabbits and a small sack of salt, and laid them on a stump between them. "I got a cabin 3 miles east," he said, turning back toward the tree line. "I ain't much for company, and I ain't much for gossip. The county don't come out this far, and I don't see no reason to invite 'em." He walked away without looking back, his snowshoes crunching softly into the white silence. He left them with food, but more importantly, he left them with their secret. The ghost in the snow had seen them, and he had decided they belonged. By the time the humid heat of August 1935 settled over the Iron Range, the Larson family had graduated from a rumor to a local legend. In the logging camps and trading posts, men whispered about the widow in the earth, a ghost story that eventually drifted onto the desk of Arthur Hayes, a county welfare officer in the county seat. Arthur was a man eroded by his job. He was a veteran of too many home visits where he found children living in squalor, bellies distended from hunger, eyes dull with neglect. He was a by-the-book bureaucrat who believed that rules existed to keep civilization from sliding back into the mud. When he received the tip about a woman raising 3 children in a hole in the ground, he didn't see a fairy tale. He saw a case file. He saw negligence. He drove his Ford as far as the logging road would take him, then hiked 4 sweating, miserable hours through the brush, following the reluctant directions of a trapper. He arrived at the site with a grim determination, mentally drafting the custody paperwork. He expected filth. He expected disease. He expected to save these children from a mad woman. What he found stopped him dead in his tracks. The underground shelter had evolved. Over the summer, Sarah and Caleb had built a proper door frame from cedar logs, fitted with a heavy oak door that swung on leather hinges. A chimney of stacked river stones now rose proudly through the earth roof. But it was the details that shattered Arthur's expectations. Wildflowers were planted in pots made from hollowed-out birch stumps by the entrance. A braided rug, vibrant with dyes Sarah had extracted from berries and roots, lay across the threshold. Arthur knocked, and the door opened to reveal a scene that looked less like a hovel and more like a page from a storybook. The interior was cool and smelled of drying herbs, wood smoke, and baking flatbread. Sarah invited him in with a calm dignity that unnerved him. She didn't plead. She didn't apologize. She simply offered him a seat on a stool woven from willow branches and poured him tea in a cup carved from smooth wood. Arthur looked for reasons to condemn her. He inspected the larder. It was stocked with smoked venison, jars of preserved berries, and sacks of wild rice. He looked at the children. They weren't the pale, frightened waifs he expected. They were brown from the sun, lean but strong, their eyes bright with a sharp intelligence. Caleb, now 13, showed Arthur the bough he had fletched himself. Emily explained which dried plants hanging from the ceiling cured a cough and which could stop bleeding. Little Lily sat on Arthur's knee, a breach of protocol he was too stunned to prevent, and told him about the fox that came to listen to their stories at night. For 3 hours, Arthur Hayes sat in that earthen room. He realized that these children weren't just surviving, they were thriving in a way that the children in the dust-choked towns were not. They had no electricity, no plumbing, and no money, but they had security. They had a mother who had literally moved the earth to keep them safe. To remove them now, to drag them back to the gray, crushing reality of the orphanage, would not be a rescue. It would be a crime. As the sun began to dip below the pines, Arthur stood up. He dusted off his trousers and put his hat back on. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with that same fierce, quiet waiting. "Mrs. Jenkins," Arthur said, clearing his throat, "I have a report to file." Sarah tightened her grip on the back of a chair. "I will write," Arthur continued, his voice firm, "that the rumors were unfounded, that I found no evidence of permanent habitation in this sector. Just an old loggers' camp, long abandoned." He met her eyes, and a silent understanding passed between them, a conspiracy of compassion. "You stay invisible, ma'am," he said softly. "The world out there, it doesn't understand places like this." Arthur Hayes walked back into the forest, carrying the weight of his lie like a badge of honor. It was the only false report he ever filed in his 20-year career, and as he walked away from the home in the hole, he knew it was the finest thing he had ever done. Time in the North Woods moves differently. It is measured not in hours, but in rings added to the timber and the slow, inevitable decomposition of what has fallen. The massive white pine that had started it all, the giant that had crashed down in 1934, eventually surrendered to the very earth it had protected. But as the wood softened and returned to the soil, the family it sheltered only grew stronger. They had achieved a kind of symbiosis, the dead tree and the living family, each supporting the other. Sarah Jenkins lived in her earthen home for 37 years. She watched the Depression fade into a world war, watched the world pave over the wilderness with asphalt and telephone lines, but she never left her sanctuary. When she passed away in 1971, at the age of 78, she wasn't a poor widow or a charity case. She was the matriarch of the forest. Caleb dug her grave himself, on the hillside just above the ventilation chimney, where the wildflowers bloomed thickest in July. The children, who had once huddled under a roof of dirt, terrified of the dark, grew into the very people the world needed. Caleb became a legendary guide, a man who could track a deer across bare rock and read the weather in the shift of the wind. Emily became the region's most trusted herbalist, carrying the ancient knowledge her mother had unlocked, proving that nature is only a threat if you don't know how to listen to it. And Lily, the little girl who once thought they were moles, she became the voice. She traveled the world, but eventually returned to write a memoir simply titled The Roots. It was her words that turned their secret survival into a lesson for millions. The original shelter still exists today, though the roof has been reinforced and the door replaced. Visitors who hike out there expect to see a monument to poverty. Instead, they find a monument to perspective. The lesson of Sarah Jenkins isn't about bushcraft or survival skills. It is about the choice we make when the sky falls. When that tree crashed down in 1934, it left a jagged, ugly wound in the forest floor. Anyone else would have seen a pit to avoid, a disaster to mourn. Sarah looked at that hole and saw a living room. She looked at the wreckage and saw raw materials. She didn't fight her circumstances. She dug into them. She proved that when life tears a hole in your ground, it is often just clearing space for a foundation that no storm can ever shake. So I have to ask you, what is the crater in your life right now? What is the disruption, the failure, or the loss that feels like a hole in the ground? If you stood at the edge of it today, what would you see? Do you see a grave? Or do you see a basement? Do you see an ending? Or do you see the beginning of something that is uniquely, unbreakably yours? Drop a comment below. I want to know. Destruction or opportunity? How are you going to build your walls? If this story shifted the way you look at your own struggles, if it reminded you that resilience is just a fancy word for refusing to move, then please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We tell stories of the impossible every single week, and you don't want to miss the next one. Because somewhere out there, a tree is falling right now. And maybe, just maybe, it's making room for you. See you in the next video.